Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Happy 2022. Can't believe we've been doing this for nearly 100 episodes and now we're into 2022. Hope you had a wonderful, wonderful new year. We're glad you're with us. We are getting back to the news. Boy, I think we could have wished that COVID would be gone by now. And then as Omicron hit, we started to think, oh no, this could be terrible. The news is kind of in between. We're going to tell you about that in just a second. Here's the agenda for today. Oops, we brought the wrong one up there. Let's try that again. There it is. COVID Connect, the COVID news. First of all, we'll tell you all what's going on in the state of Michigan. After that, the feedback was that folks liked our series that we were doing. You remember back in August, we focused on manufacturing, and then after that, we did a series on 510K. And as we went through these series, folks liked the depth of them. And we thought, you know, there's one group that we've really omitted as we try to bring in everybody in the MedTech community. We've talked to the manufacturers, we've talked to the VCs, we'll continue to do that. We've talked to the inventors and the entrepreneurs. We've talked to people who are funding at state and local levels. We've talked to so many people. The one group we haven't talked to is those who are educating the next generation of folks who are going to work in the MedTech industry. So this week, at the beginning of January here, we're going to kick off MedTech in higher education. And we're going to be spending a handful of weeks talking with folks who are in the trenches, educating people, often for the very first time that they've been exposed to these ideas, about what the MedTech industry is like and how they can be prepared to work in it. So my guest later today will be Professor Jan Steggemann from the University of Michigan's Biomedical Engineering Department, and I'm looking forward to talking with him. But first, the COVID news. This from healthdata.gov. Those state summaries are still there. So if you happen to be listening to this from another state, you can go to healthdata.gov. In their main search bar, type in the name of your state, and you'll find an up-to-date state summary of what's going on with COVID numbers in your state. These summaries are, I forget now, 25, 30 pages long. They're really wonderful summaries. And I don't usually put this slide up, but this week I'm going to for this very simple reason. While you can see the story almost entirely here, while the rate of new cases is up, while the nucleic acid positivity rate is up, and even perhaps a slight uptick in hospitalizations, but basically neutral. Deaths are currently down in the state of Michigan by a dramatic amount. Let's look at the details here, even though transmission is high. Also this, before we get to the details of hospitalizations, deaths, and cases, the variants that the CDC does track, right now, they're saying that in the last 4 weeks, Michigan has had 0% Omicron. We're going to dig a little bit more to hopefully tell you why that is. But it is interesting how they're saying it's still mostly Delta in the state of Michigan. That may be from not enough specific testing that's able to get the lab testing, but we don't know the answer to that. We're going to dig for that for you. This chart we've been doing for, at least the last 6 months, showing vaccination percentage versus the cases. And as you can see, as we now know, and especially over the holidays learned, vaccination and boosting don't do much to reduce the transmission of COVID. It's mostly about the outcomes in the hospital. And that's where some of the good news is. So if we look at cases, they certainly haven't dropped yet. The cases are still bouncing along there, about at the average daily rate that they were during the last 2 waves. So it's not like the cases have started to drop yet at all. Nor has the positivity rate. It made it all the way up to 20%, dropped a little bit, and then came back to 20%, which is about where it is now. People are testing positive for COVID like literally never before. But here's the good news. Those deaths do seem to start to be plateauing. Time will tell, but that is good news. The deaths are down, even having had some weeks to watch them come up. We know they lag hospitalizations. And hospitalizations themselves, you could be forgiven for thinking that they are passing a peak. Now, it could come right back up, but That's not what we're seeing. That's also not what other countries with Omicron have seen. And of course, experts caution that it could be different. We have different demographics here. For example, South Africa, which had a relatively uh, easy, shall I say, experience with Omicron, does have a younger population, so that could make a difference. But nevertheless, a little bit of heartening news here because deaths down, hospitalizations down, with some weeks for those to have risen and not seeing that. So, some of the best news we've been able to share in a long time. That being said, Michigan is a sea of red when it comes to community transmission. We are deep, deep, deep in this transmission cycle that we've been in, oh goodness, ever since September, October. So that has not dropped really at all. Vaccinations, this very, very slow climb ever since June, but nowhere near the peaks last April. And yet it does continue to climb up here with little drops here and there. Community transmission in the U.S. is the same story as here in Michigan, mostly a sea of red. Won't necessarily expect to see that change anytime soon, but certainly some good news here coming out of hospitalizations and deaths. In fact, hospitalizations across the country, we saw this swath going from Arizona up to Vermont, basically, that had this diagonal swath right through the country, and it's starting to dwindle. It really is starting to dwindle. It's a lot less red than it was in previous weeks that we've looked at this. Michigan actually out of the bottom tier there, not in the most red states. And there's a layer of red that would be darker than any you see here. So that is actually relatively good news that we're seeing on the hospitalization front across the country, which is probably why you started to hear on the news. Some say that, yeah, we are starting to see that Omicron is what we had hoped, that it is milder than previous variants. So some great news there in Michigan and across the country. Certainly glad to be tracking this with you. It will be interesting to look back over time at these sessions we've had together as we've tracked the CDC's data, specifically in the state of Michigan, but also little bits across the U.S. We will revisit some of this in coming weeks, especially this whole question of, are we experiencing Omicron, or what exactly are we experiencing here? Really interesting data there out of the CDC. We'll continue to track that next week with you. But now it's time to talk about what's happening in 2022 on MedTech Crossroads. We are so thankful for the interest in this show, the fact that people have always used and been encouraged by the things that we're doing. We were a little surprised last year when our series started to get such interest. People really liked it when we had manufacturers on to talk about different approaches to manufacturing, different things that they needed to know if they wanted to approach a manufacturer. We did it also with some regulatory topics like 510Ks. The topic areas for 2022 that we're going to be looking at, and we start this month with higher education, things like higher education, clinical and hospital practice, regulatory topics, testing, including animal and clinical trials, general topics in product development, drug and biologic specific topics, manufacturing, software. Also, we'll talk about the market analysis, market execution, because that's definitely of interest to product companies, funding mechanisms, and those range all the way from friends and family to state sources like MEDC provides here in the state of Michigan, to angel investors, all the way up to venture capital and other institutional types of investors. We'll be talking about all of those coming up soon. We'll also touch on intellectual property because that's an important topic too. As we do that this year, we're going to try to do it in a little more series manner, bringing interviewees in. It was a little scattershot in previous years where the interviewees would be all over the place. This year we're going to try to bring them in waves and talk to them so we can get different pictures and different opinions about what's going on in these areas. As always, our goal is to support the MedTech community, people who are trying to bring medical technology to patients, trying to bring it in different ways, but we're all part of that same community. And so this month we thought, it's really time to talk to those who are educating the next generation of those who will work in this industry. We've talked to those in academia, but it's often been at a translational level, and we'll continue to do that. But this week, we want to start with our friend Professor Jan Steggemann from the University of Michigan, Department of Biomedical Engineering. Welcome to 2022 and welcome to MedTech Crossroads, Jan.
Thank you, Gene. Happy New Year. Thanks for having me. I'm very glad that you're able to deliver first an excellent overview of the COVID situation, but also kind of a happier one than we've had in a while. So that's great. And
no joke, you picked the right week to be on here, man.
Well, hopefully next week's even better. But thank you for also doing these sessions. As we've discussed, I think they're really good for kind of the local and regional ecosystem. And I'm glad you're doing something on higher education. So I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry it's taken us a year and a half to get there, but we realized that what does turn into very important translational work in the universities and in academia, and there's some cool funding mechanisms and programs there, it actually gets implanted into students' minds and hearts, and that vision of, oh, I could do this. There's something here for me. It really gets implanted at an earlier level, and you are one of the people that we know who has been doing that, who has been working with students. It's not always, it can be thankless work sometimes, I think, when you're beating your head against a wall. But it's been in your blood for a while. Why don't you start by telling us about your history, your own educational pathway, your work history, and then how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll try to make it brief, and I guess I'll try to make it relevant to what we're talking about today. So I am a chemical engineer by undergraduate training. So I did my undergrad in chemical engineering, and then I went and I worked actually on contract. I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, so I searched for jobs in Europe. I got a 6-month contract in Germany to work at a large engineering consulting firm. So I worked on that contract for 6 months, and I designed chemical plants. And I certainly enjoyed the experience. It was wonderful, eye-opening in a lot of ways. But one of the things I realized very clearly was that I did not want to design chemical plants for the rest of my life. So I actually came back and I did my master's degree in chemical engineering. But this time I kind of retrained and I focused much more on the biomedical area. So bioengineering, biomedical engineering. And I was very fortunate right when I was finishing my master's degree, my lab got a call from a headhunter, and they were looking for somebody who worked exactly in the area that I was working in. So I moved to Boston, and I worked at a company. It was at the time a very large conglomerate chemical company, W.R. Grace and Company. They had a relatively, it was quite large, but for them it was a small biomedical research division. And that's where I started my career. And I worked really in product development. It was really, I mean, this was a long time ago. I hesitate to say how long ago it was, but it was in the mid-90s. And we were working on artificial pancreas and liver assist devices. So really pretty complex technologies. And we got IDEs for both of those products and those devices. And so it was a really exciting time. I got to be part of this where these products went from research. I was a research engineer, and we moved towards having an IDE. And I suddenly learned what GMP was and how research is different from development, and development is different from production. And like I said, this was the mid-90s where, this is really when GMPs were being evolved for medical devices. That's really when they became formal for the medical device field. So it was a very dynamic time, shall we say. I learned a ton. And I actually ended up staying in the research part of the division, and the kind of production started going GMP, but I got to be part of it and watch it. It was very, very interesting. But what I ended up deciding was that I would rather not just do research, but direct research. So I went back and did my doctorate, my PhD in biomedical engineering. And at the time when I did that, I actually thought I would go back into industry. I'd probably go into a research and development role in industry. That was probably my goal if I could remember it now. But as I was going through the PhD, I guess I saw the potential for excitement and reward and I guess some fun in an academic career. So I ended up saying, well, I'll apply for some academic jobs. If I get them, I'll see how that goes. And then if I don't, maybe I'll try some industry jobs. And as it turns out, I got a job. So I started my academic career at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is a small technical college in upstate New York. And just very quickly, my research program then and still is on biomaterials, largely for cell-based therapies. But what I took with me from my time in industry has always stayed with me. It was very important. Was how ill prepared I felt when we started switching from research into development and GMP. I really realized that my master's degree had not prepared me to be in that kind of an environment. So ever since my first job at RPI, I've always taught in the area of medical product development. So at RPI, I taught a course. It was called Commercialization of Biomedical Technologies. It was with a co-worker in the business school, Shrifal Mehta. So he and I co-taught this course, and it was really a didactic course, but it was much more about product development and portfolio planning and a little bit on IP and regulatory product development processes, that kind of thing, a lot of case studies. And I really, really enjoyed it. It was a very well-received class, and I really thought it made an impact. I think our students felt the difference when they took that course and how they were prepared. And this was an undergraduate course, by the way. It was actually a course that was preparing them for their senior design experience. So that's kind of, been one of my main interests ever since I started, well, ever since I graduated my master's. But more recently, I moved to Michigan. So actually recently being 14 years ago, but but I also brought that with me coming to Michigan. And when I got here, I had the opportunity to take over a course that had actually been started by a colleague, Eileen Huang Saad. It's called Graduate Innovative Design in Biomedical Engineering. So at the time, it was a very heavy design build test course. It was very fast paced and innovative. And if you know Eileen, it had a lot of things thrown in it all at once. It was a really great course for a lot of reasons. But I ended up taking it over because she shifted positions in the university. And over the years, I've been kind of, adding and I guess in some cases subtracting and shifting what we've been doing. And maybe that's some of the things we can talk about to make that course really about medical product development. And I would call it kind of advanced medical product development because in our undergraduate program, we have design courses every year now, and culminating with a big senior design capstone course, as most engineering disciplines have. And those have really evolved a lot since I've been here as well. We have a great group of instructors. So all of the design, most of the engineering design type of teaching is in the undergrad. And what I've been focusing on is actually the graduate level kind of advanced medical product development that brings in some other things that are not in undergrad, partly just because of lack of time and space.
Wow, that's quite a journey. I resonate also with your statement of not really knowing what you wanted to do when you got out. I think on the one hand, it's frustrating when you're there, but at the same time, it actually opens you up to what do I actually want to do here, and allows you to take that journey. If I take you back to that journey though for just a second, you said you started out designing chemical plants, and you knew that wasn't for you. And then you got to work on this artificial pancreas project. Give us a little insight into your mind, because I think one of the things we're talking about here is helping students find their place. We're going to have a really powerful workforce in MedTech. If people are inspired and have passion for what they do, you started to find some of that passion, and it wasn't in chemical plants, and nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's a lot of people who work for Dow Chemical, and God bless them, they're doing great stuff. That wasn't your thing. You found it in this med tech world. Take us into your mind. What went through your mind as you were thinking about one versus the other? What was it that stood out to you? Again, we're not saying anything bad about one industry versus another, but for you, that drew you to the med tech industry, what was it?
Yeah, I think it's actually relatively simple and relatively common, shall I say, amongst our students now, which is the work I did was not that different than what I might do as a biomedical engineer. I was a chemical engineer and I did analyses of processes. You can do that as a biomedical engineer. It was really the application. So it was really the fact that it was going to affect human health. Of course, industry does affect human health in many ways, or the chemical process industry does as well. But more directly kind of being involved in medicine and biology was much more interesting to me just as an application of my engineering skills. And I think if you ask biomedical engineering students, and you may have done it when you visited our class, but many of our speakers kind of go around and ask the students, well, why is it that you're doing biomedical instead of mechanical or aerospace? And to a person, they almost always say, I really want to do something that affects human health. I don't necessarily want to be a physician, but I just can't see myself being, just designing things that are not affecting the human condition. So, I don't know if that's a simple answer, but I think in my case, that was really what it was. It was just the end goal.
Yeah, it's interesting because it strikes me that so many times people want to see their work mean something, and for different people that'll mean different things. But MedTech does offer that that what you're working on has the potential to either help or hurt a person. Like it really focuses it down. We often hear that in the startup world too, and it's gonna be an interesting conversation today because we're talking. A lot of your students are not focused on the startup world; they're actually focused on big business. We'll get there in a minute, but a lot of times people will say, "Well, I want to be focused on something where I can see the result of my work," and I think you're bringing out this other aspect, which is I want the result of my work to. It's either going to help or hurt this person right there.
Mhm.
So that's really cool. Well, so then you made this journey, and here you are at U of M, and you've taken over this course, and you're working with it. I was really interested when you and I talked earlier, Jan, that you have a very current working mindset of what students need to hear about. And you said it's at a graduate level that you're doing this, that you're trying to teach the more fundamentals at an undergraduate level, and then at a graduate level, you're trying to give them, I think you said to me, language or vocabulary.
Yeah, language, vocabulary, terminology. I mean, as we all know, there's an acronym, jungle out there. I don't know what you want to call it, but there's a lot of acronyms in our field, as there are in every field. But it's not necessarily about just learning the acronyms, but I think it's about understanding what they mean to the extent that you can be in a conversation. And I think what I'll be talking about, I should kind of preface this. What I'll be talking about mainly today, I think, is the graduate level, the master's level course that I've been teaching, and the kind of associated courses. And I don't want to minimize what goes on in the undergraduate program. It's just I'm not as familiar with it, and it is much more fundamental engineering and engineering design. So in the graduate version, my very fairly simple stated goal is really just to make our students better prepared to be impactful and effective when they start their careers. And so part of that is to help them start their careers and find the appropriate job for them. But then also as they progress, to know what's available and to know, how to navigate their career based on what the medical device industry looks like. And I think part of that is just being in the conversation and knowing the terminology. And it's not about just memorizing the acronyms. It's about understanding how these things fit together, and I guess context and environment in which medical products are developed.
What are some of those topics? I'm sure some will be familiar to our listeners here on the show, but if you were to give us a cross section of high level topics that you think it's important for these graduate biomedical engineers to know about, we'll talk in a minute about why they need to know about it and the entities that they're going towards. But what's a cross section of these topics?
Well, I guess one way to do that is I can tell you what the class currently looks like, which it changes a bit every year because as you said, I do try to keep it current. That's one of my real focuses. So I can tell you a little bit about what we do now. And so it's still, the course is a two semester, so a full year master's level course. It is still focused around a design, build, test experience. So that's actually the heart of the course, but we don't actually talk a lot about design because, like I said, all of the students have taken that before. We do work on clinical needs finding, which again has been infused into our undergraduate program very nicely. And then we do the design process. We don't really study it. We just do it on a current clinical problem. So there's this kind of design, build, test that is the backbone of the course. But the topics that you're talking about are built around that. And I guess the way I phrase it is, first of all, I want the students to know something about the environment, like I said, the context in which they're doing this, so that we learn about the medical device industry as a whole. it's amazing. Well, it shouldn't be, maybe it's not amazing, but our students don't necessarily understand how big is this industry, what's shaping it, what are the trends, what are the drivers, what are the challenges. Michigan is, a lot of people know about the automotive industry and read about the challenges in that every single day, but MedTech is a different industry. So we talk about that.
Mm.
And then as part of that, I really want the students, like I said, to know about career opportunities. So what roles are there out there that might be of interest to them? How do they get those particular roles? How do they get those jobs? So there's a fairly straightforward, let's see how to make you ready to get a job. And then, like I said, once you get into that job, how do you navigate your career? And then we also talk about leadership in MedTech, because then leadership in MedTech is potentially different than leadership in other disciplines as well. So there's that kind of an overarching topic. But then in the course itself, I'd say that the core topics are really quality and risk. So we have shifted in the last few years about really focusing on quality, meaning quality systems, not just design controls, but going a little bit broader about what a quality management system looks like and why it matters and how it's regulated, et cetera, both here and now in Europe. And then risk management, because, the more I've done this, the more I've realized that, risk is from day one till the very end. Risk is your primary, concern, so to speak. So we do a lot on risk management, hazard analysis, and a very, kind of a formal version of that, which again, they do some of that in undergrad, but this is a much more, I'd say a more expanded version. And then there are what I would call, I guess I'd call them almost secondary topics, but we try to bring these in and we kind of shift the focus every year depending on the class and depending on the landscape of the industry. But we talk about IP, we talk about regulatory, but actually not so much as, more about actually things like post-market surveillance and recalls and failures, which in undergrad, you're focused more on pathways of getting your device onto the market. But post-market surveillance is probably the more important part of regulation, and that gets short shrift in the undergrad program. So we do a lot on that. We do a little bit on manufacturing, and this is an area that you've worked on with this webinar series. I would love to have much more on manufacturing, design for manufacturing. That would be really great. And then the other thing we work on a little bit is might broadly be called kind of business competency. So a little bit about basic financial accounting, very basic project management, the idea of value-based care, which is really important now. We talk a little bit about monetization and reimbursement. So a lot of flavors of these things. And obviously we cannot make experts in all these fields. But again, my overall goal is to make our students understand the context in which these devices are being developed and to understand what their teammates or their bosses or the other people in the company, what they're concerned about and why.
That's wonderful. It shocked me when you told me in our previous conversation that most of your students are actually targeting big business. A lot of these folks coming here to Michigan, they actually want to go work for the Strykers and the J&Js and other companies like that. Tell us a little bit about the demographic of their interests and what are the students looking for?
Yeah, so again, I'll kind of preface this that in both the undergraduate program and the graduate program, our students kind of fall into three kind of categories. And it's maybe you could roughly say a third. It varies by year, but there are those who want to go to medical school. BME is a pretty good background to get into medical school. There are those who want to go on to grad school, either do a master's or a PhD, potentially go into academia or go into R&D. And then there's those who want to go into industry. And the ones that I teach are graduate students who, to a person, want to go into industry. They're in what's called the medical product development concentration in our graduate program. So they're a fairly self-selected group. So first of all, there are lots of BMEs who want to go to med school and do other things. But of the ones that I've worked with over the last decade or so who are interested in industry, the large majority are actually interested in working at Stryker or Medtronic or J&J. There are certainly entrepreneurial people, but they're a smaller fraction. And there are people who enjoy the startup environment and they really want to start out there and learn everything. I'm sure you've talked about and I know you've talked about the differences between a startup versus a mid-size and all that kind of thing. But I literally did a survey this year because I was just kind of wanted to get some numbers. I forgot to look it up, but I mean, over 80% wanted to work at a mid-sized to large company. And, we can talk a little bit about why that might be, but I think you touched on it earlier in that, in a way, if you really want to see your work realized, it's probably going to happen faster through Medtronic. A startup is a long road. It's an interesting, exciting road, and you can really see what your product might do, but it's also probably a longer road, I think. Maybe that's up for debate.
I guess there's the sense in which any given product has a higher risk within a startup, and the road can be a long one. Medtronic is launching the next variation on its product next year, and it's gonna go out, right? They're making subtle changes, but it is gonna ship. That product's gonna ship. Yeah, that's really interesting. And that really puts you at an interesting place between the needs of these students who are there to learn and there to find themselves and find their careers. What am I going to do? And you and I were both ones who were like, well, I'm not quite sure what I want to do. We're going to have to go explore that. But trying to give them the best vision of what is there. I think you described yourself. Did you use the word cruise director in your
Yeah.
description?
Yeah, I mean,
Which
that's
is
what I tell my students. I'm not. I do well. Actually, I do more now. But in the past, I did very little didactic teaching. Lecturing with slides. First of all, that's not the great way to teach. But second of all, I'm not the person to be giving those lectures. So I depend heavily on outside experts, including yourself, Gene, who's been wonderful. Come to our class year after year and talked about translating user needs into design inputs, which is great. And so what I've tried to do is kind of stay, close to the practice. That's one of the characteristics of biomedical engineering is it is very close to the practice because you need to know what's going on in medicine in order to be able to, solve those problems. And for that reason, I bring in people from industry a lot to talk about their experiences. So they do kind of give a didactic version, but they are also a fountain of information about, the war stories and that kind of stuff, which is really a nice way for students to learn, as you probably know. But I call myself a cruise director, largely because my job really, as I said, there's a design, build, test sequence going, is to help these students and these student teams figure out who they need to talk to get the information that they need. Sometimes it's me, sometimes it's the TA, but more often I can try to give them the starting information to get them to the next step so that when they speak to somebody, they can speak intelligently about it and get the problem solved. And that's how I see myself. And it's evolved, like I said, because the design, build, test part of this course is actually a smaller component than it used to be. And it used to be really about solving the problems on these specific projects. But now there's also these bigger issues about where do we get the information, the current information about what's going on in EU MDR, or how do we, use MOD these days, a variety of different things. And again, I like to talk to people who are actually doing it now. And that's really where you're going to get the best information.
Well, that really does preview for them what a working life in this industry is going to be like. So much of the work that you do from day to day is talking with people with different disciplines in your industry, trying to understand which direction should we go in this, which trigger do we pull. It's often a quick thing to pull the trigger, but to understand how it fits. And you're giving them a breadth then of these things, which is interesting because many of these will not go on to be a quality engineer, will not go on to be a regulatory scientist, or will not go on to be any number of things. But you've got, I think, a very specific reason for giving them this breadth. You talked about cross-functional teams in big companies.
Yeah, I think that's really the bottom line is I want them to be able to be effective on cross-functional teams. And that's what our stakeholders say they want. They want people who can, when you ask, our employers, our stakeholders, what they want, they always want good communication skills, number one, probably number 1, 2, and 3, maybe. And then about technical and other communication skills. And then they talk about teamwork and being able to function a cross-functional team. And that's why, you might ask like, oh, you're going into all these kind of topics and you can't go very deep into any of them. And I take that as true. I mean, that's a challenge, but you can understand enough to hopefully understand what your colleague is thinking and why they have a certain perspective. And even sometimes you might be able to bring things up that other people hadn't thought of because you're thinking of the bigger picture. I really am trying to figure out what it is that biomedical engineers bring to the table. We have wonderful mechanical engineers here. We have outstanding electrical engineers, computer engineers, civil engineers at this university. So one of my challenges and goals is to decide what is it that a biomedical engineer can bring to a MedTech company that is real value added. And like I said, I think it's a bit more context. It's a little bit more of the bigger picture, and hopefully that will help them be effective.
That's a really important point you made there. I mean, I remember we've all got those stories from our initial working in an industry, and I remember when I worked for my first startup, I had never sat across from a person who had any concern about marketing issues or business operations issues to see that the whole thing flowed well. I was an engineer and I was a good engineer and I knew the right answer. And if I had had just a little bit of empathy for the person sitting across the table, I remember at least one episode where I would have been more of an asset to the company that I was with, and we would have not had a couple hiccups that we had because, oh man, I knew all the right answers, but I couldn't empathize with their chair. I couldn't empathize with what it was that they needed to get done in their job. So I really commend that you're trying to give this breadth of insight, and not just in a didactic way. I think that's what's so cool, because if you ask them to wrestle with, you mentioned EU MDR, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you're digging into that. If you ask them to dig into a topic, then they have an empathy for it intrinsically because they had to think about it. So I think that's just so cool.
Yeah, and I'll mention, I mean, I like the word empathy. I don't think I used it, but I'm going to in the future. But we do actually quite a few case studies. We also teach through cases, and we use a variety of packaged cases. We actually make our own cases sometimes, but for that very reason, is to be able to look at situations from different people's perspectives. And we do, I think it's called MedAssist. It's a Harvard case study. It's literally about a cross-functional team with everybody having their different priorities and nobody understanding why the other person's being so adamant about things that they don't think are important. So, and I think it really, well, these are things you will figure out like you did when you went into industry, but I'm not sure you have to make it the hard way always.
It shouldn't be a from scratch, let's do it the hard way. We got to have at least this knowledge that there are different disciplines. And it's so confusing the first time you encounter that, because just to put myself back in that situation, you've worked really, really hard to get good, better than everybody else at something, and you want that to shine. But this isn't a solo sport. Bringing almost any product to market isn't a solo sport anymore. And so you've got to understand that. Which is the interesting thing about specialization, I think, isn't it? You would have more to say on this than I, but like specialization is a blessing and a curse, because we get specialized means we can talk about something really, really deeply, but if we can't relate that to other people, it stands alone and it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, another thing that I kind of thought of as you were speaking along that line is, I like the fact that this is a graduate level course, because another thing that it brings, I think, which is important, is comfort with uncertainty. So engineers, like you said, they go very deep, they understand it well, and they can come to an answer and like, well, this is pretty obvious now they've done all this work. But when you have all the information, that's easy. But of course, as we know, you don't have all the information. And again, and the undergraduate level, you can't just waddle around, or you can't wave around too much, because you have to get to answers, because that's really part of the engineering design process. The graduate level, I can say, look, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know. There's no right answer. Go ahead, see what happens. And certainly some of our students are not that comfortable with that, and hopefully they become more comfortable. And again, when they go work with people, they won't be adamant about saying, no, I figured out the answer already. Why are we still talking about this? Because it's not necessarily the only answer.
Sometimes the lesson is that part of the journey where you accept some of the uncertainty. That's great. Well, Jan, this has got to have had an effect on you. I want to ask you questions about, the students and the businesses and stuff, but let me come back to you. You've been doing this for 14 years at University of Michigan, before that at Rensselaer, and then in your career before that. How has this changed you and how you think about the educational process?
Yeah, it's been a real kind of an evolution because on the one hand, I've always been doing something along these lines, but on the other hand, I don't think I've done the same thing twice in these courses. And so that's why, I mean, to teach a course for 10 years is it sounds like a terrible thing. So most faculty would say, "Oh my God, how could you possibly do that?" Because I don't know if there are going to be faculty members in the audience, but the first year you teach a course is really hard. Second year, you kind of got some under your belt, and then third, fourth, and fifth are much easier, and then it becomes kind of boring, and you want to switch. I've never taught this course twice the same way, and if I had to kind of summarize maybe how I've evolved and how maybe the course has evolved along with me is really by trying to stay current, as you mentioned, really trying to get information from outside to inform our curriculum. And at the risk of I don't want to insult academia, but we have this great group of researchers and faculty who are research superstars and world-class scientists, but not a lot of them actually have a lot of industry experience. So our faculty is not necessarily a great resource. We have, luckily, a few faculty who have industry experience and really good instructors who also are very focused on design. But what I try to do is when I bring in guest speakers, I'll just ask them, like, what's on your mind these days? When you go back to the office, what are you going to be thinking about that's really, bugging you or is coming down the pike that you're worried about? And when I hear about those things, especially when I hear about them 2 or 3 times from 2 or 3 different people, then I'll say, okay, we should probably start to incorporate that. And so, the latest version of the course, as you can imagine, has changed because of the pandemic, and will presumably continue to change as we get through it, or whatever, or to the next stage of it, whatever you want to call it. So I think to me, I've kind of always been trying to educate myself for the purpose of bringing those things to the course, and that's the only reason I could ever teach this course for 10 years in a row.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting method of teaching too, because you're saying, what are the things that I need to learn? And then not how do I didactically, like you said, teach people this, but rather how do I expose them to those challenges and give them people around them so that they can be held to find those answers. And that becomes a very, very powerful lesson in those lives. You're at a very interesting place between industry, which you bring both as mentors and as potential suitors for the students, right? Because they're looking for people to hire, and the students themselves acting as this catalyst to really get the work started. This working relationship. I think if I had to phrase what I've heard, you're enabling people to work on the kinds of topics that matter in industry, in a way that industry talks about them with people from industry who might be interested in working with them. It's really a great, almost a courtship at some level for those who want to go into industry. We talked a little bit about some of the things that industry is saying. I want communication skills. I want the ability to play nice on a team. Are there any other things that industry is saying that you hear, maybe even this year? What is industry currently saying? And another question to go along with that: where are the students strong? Where do they really shine? And where are the places where you're sort of still constantly working because there are these typical issues that come out where it's like, oh, if we could just solve this, we'd be great. So you're in between these two groups. You're trying to bring them together in good, useful ways that are probably going to result in jobs, which is really cool. Yeah, tell us about each of them. What's hot for industry right now, and what are the things that the students are good at, and what are the things that we still have to work on?
Sure. So I should say, I mean, I'm a big fan of our students. We have a wonderful group of students, and the ones that come into my class in particular are very self-selected. So they're very, they're diverse in some ways, but they're very homogeneous in what they want to accomplish with their careers. And they're very you don't take a graduate engineering design class just for an easy credit, because it's way more work than you're going to get for credit. So I think it's a really nice group. And I've also clearly noticed over the past 5-6 years that they have become much stronger in their design skills. And that's largely due to the efforts at the undergraduate level to really beef up our design program, which it's always been good, but I think it's gotten better. And I've noticed it in my class because they come in and they're just more prepared. And I should say right now, probably about 75% of my class are students from our own program. There's a accelerated bachelor's master's program that they can do. And so those students this course is popular with those students. And so we have about 75% of them. Then the other 25% are students from other institutions, either domestically or internationally. And most of those, or well, a good chunk of those are biomedical engineers, but there are also some other engineering disciplines in there, and even some non-engineering disciplines. And also we have students coming from mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, et cetera. So anyways, I want to give credit to the students. They are the ones who make this run. They are strong in general. They're academically good. But what I often find, and what I also try to do at the graduate level, is that they're a little, they don't have a lot of confidence in their knowledge. And, when you think about, they just graduated with their bachelor's in biomedical engineering from a good college, either from our college or from another good college somewhere else. They know a lot more about biomedical engineering than 99.9% of the population of the planet, but they sometimes are reticent to show it, I think. And I actually think that one of the reasons is that they don't understand, again, the context. They don't really see what they do fits in. And when they see that, they're able to talk about it more, and they're also able to talk about their own skills more. Because if you just ask them about what they know about something, it's just a very isolating question. Whereas if they know a little bit more about the broader context, I think they're more comfortable. So that's one of my goals is, and I explicitly tell them, you guys are experts in this field. You are, world-class experts in some cases in this field. Even you're young and you're just starting, but relative to the general population, you are experts. And then in terms of what our stakeholders and industry employers want, I mentioned communication.
If I can even stop you right there, Jan, I think you made an amazing point right there, just on the students one, and that's a personal and a professional lesson, because I think what I just heard you say is that if you understand those around you and their needs and their disciplines and things like that, you said it's the context that if I don't understand where I fit into this, I won't value myself as highly in what I can bring and offer as I should. So I'm gonna have to chew on that one, because that was like that was the philosophical nugget for the kickoff for 2022 for me. That was great.
Yeah,
Just
well,
wanted to
I would
highlight
say,
that. But yeah, go ahead with this.
I mean, in some cases, I think students just they know something and they think, well, everybody must know that because I know that. That's not true at all. You're one of the very few people who knows this, but they need to see like I said, the context of where they fit in. And then back to our stakeholders, I'd say, we talked about communication, technical communication. They obviously want technical skills if they're hiring engineers. They obviously often CAD and design skills, and we do our best to give them that in the undergraduate as much as we can. I talked a little bit about the business skills that they sometimes mention, knowing a little bit about project management, and a little bit about financial project management. So we're starting to incorporate that. But the big topics that come up lately, as you might not be surprised, are so telehealth, big, and these are all pandemic related, or mostly pandemic related. Telehealth is a big issue. Remote sensing, so remote patient monitoring, it comes up a lot. AI and ML are on everybody's lips right off the bat. Software as a medical device, and cybersecurity is a huge issue. So again, we cannot make experts in any of these fields in our program, but we can tell our students enough about these things that they know they're important, and that they know that they can maybe learn more about them under certain circumstances when they need to. And the other, I'd be interested actually in what the audience and other people have to think about this, but the other thing that I've seen recently is that, recently being like 3 or 5 years, is that systems engineering is becoming much more important, because medical devices are becoming much more complex. So biomedical engineers are really well placed to be systems engineers because they are not necessarily the master of the circuit board, but they understand how that all fits together and how it ends up in the clinic and how it attaches to the patient. So that's another area that's one of those words that come into my ears enough times where I'm like, okay, now we really have to figure out what systems engineering is and how we can help our students, if they want to, assume those roles.
That's great, and you're so right because medical devices really are thought of as systems, and oftentimes they incorporate things that people don't think of as subsuming what is part of the device. So that's great. And speaking of the audience, yeah, if you got a question for Dr. Steggemann, please do ask it. We've already got one here from Drew. He said, I'd like to connect with Professor Steggemann to network and discuss possible internship candidates. Is there contact information that you'd be willing to share here? We can also do a personal introduction afterwards. But Jan, how would you like people to get hold of you?
So I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. Who is that, Drew?
Drew, yep.
Yeah, Drew. Okay, I can connect with him on LinkedIn. I'm happy to. Internships are a topic I would love to talk about.
I will send you guys both a mutual introduction since I have you both after this. But yeah, we'll see if there's any other questions from the audience. Feel free to raise your hand in the thing. We will make that introduction. But any questions for Dr. Steggemann? We're waiting to see if any more come in. As we close up here, one thing I want you to tell us about is you're going on sabbatical, like starting now, which is really, really cool. You're going to be studying something that I think is of interest, and maybe after you're done with your sabbatical, you're going to come back. Maybe I can put that on you to tell us all about what you've learned, because the European Union has been a crazy place when it comes to medical device regulation. Tell us what you're going to be studying yourself for the next while.
Yeah, sure. It's still, I think, coming together, but well, first of all, I'm not sure if everybody on the call knows what sabbatical is. I had to explain it to my students. They were like, isn't that when you just like go on vacation? I'm like, no, it's not a vacation. It's really, I get a relief from my teaching duties. And my service duties. So I really have to keep my research running, which I'll be keeping my research running remotely, but I'm going to be going to be a visiting professor at the Danish Technical University in Copenhagen. And they have a Department of Health Technology. And I'm actually going to be working with them on learning about the EU MDR and the UDAMED and all the things that are kind of coming to pass in Europe. And of course, there's a huge harmonization effort, between the US and the European Union. I really want to immerse myself in that in a way from their perspective. There are some nice medical device companies in Denmark I'd like to go visit. And the upshot of it all is actually that I'm going to be teaching my full-term course in the summer in 3 weeks for them. And I'm not actually sure how that's done. So I'll let you know about that when I get back. But the point is I'm actually teaching an advanced medical product development course at the Danish Technical University. So I'm really excited about that. New types of students. It's all a little bit up in the air. We're doing a lot of paperwork now to see if it can happen. But I think from my own perspective, in terms of a sabbatical and what I want to learn and enrich myself with, it's just the European regulatory and really product development environment, which is becoming so much more meshed with our own. So I think that's a good thing for our own students to know.
Well, that's going to be great. We appreciate you getting out there and doing that. Not just sunning yourself on the French Riviera or something like that, but you're studying the European regulations. So that really is of interest because it's something that's been very, very cloudy and opaque and changing constantly for the last few years. So that'll be a great thing to be learning about. Introduction made between you and Drew. Thanks for the compliments in the chat. Also, thanks to Jeff Reinveld. Jeff is actually, we're going to be talking about our advisory board later on here in the beginning of this year. But Jeff Reinveld from Renaissance Venture Capital running a point there. Yeah, you can find this episode later up at intobeing.com/medtech-crossroads Charlotte. So thanks for asking about that. We are up at the top of the hour here. Jan, I wonder if you have any closing thoughts for our audience. We really appreciate your doing this, kicking off 2022 for us, and sending you on your way to your sabbatical to bring us all sorts of great information back when it's over. What are your final words for us?
Well, again, thank you for having me. And more importantly, I think thank you for doing these webinars. And maybe I didn't mention this, but what I really want to do is, it's not just about University of Michigan. I really want to help the local and the regional ecosystem. I'm very Michigan focused. I mean, the University of Michigan has has, I think, a mandate to help the state as well. So I really want to interact with local, regional industry, other academic institutions. We have wonderful academic institutions that I'd like to partner with. Grand Valley State has medical product development, Lawrence Tech, MSU, obviously, and also the government, the various government resources that we have. So I'm really hoping that we help our students be effective in their careers. And I often see that they want to stay in Michigan, but it's hard because there's not as much MedTech in Michigan as there could be. So all of the people who are listening, who are starting companies, I want to be able to help you by supplying, the workforce that is really going to make a difference. And if any feedback you have on how to do that, I would take it and welcome it. And really just thanks for having me, Gene, because it's great to have an audience like this.
Well, we appreciate your being here. We wish you the best in your travels. And so we thank you for being with us. One quick question here from Ken. Jan, do you work with the Zell-Lurie Institute at Ross? We'll get that one in real quick before we go.
Not directly. I know people there, and the great thing about the University of Michigan is there's a whole ton of different initiatives going on, including on MedTech product development. But that's also a challenge because you just can't interact with all of them. So that's also kind of just super quickly. We're actually talking about kind of formalizing our medical product development program beyond what it is now, which is just a concentration in our master's program. And if we do that, I really hope to partner not just internally, but also externally with some other folks. But Zell-Lurie is definitely on the list.
Really exciting. Jan, thank you for being here.
Sure. Have a good day, Gene.
We appreciate having you.
All right.
We'll give these last 30 seconds to the audience in case there's any questions, comments, or events that you want to announce. We always like to leave 30 seconds there. Sometimes there's something happening in the community and you want to tell us about it. We'll leave these last 30 seconds for that. We're looking forward to continuing our education focus next week and throughout the month of January. So I hope 2022 is starting off well for you. We're going to check here really quick. Not seeing any comments. I want to thank you for being with us here on MedTech Crossroads. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.